Well, my dear listeners, tonight we open these forgotten doors, behind which our youth keeps crouching with scraped knees and a stolen ticket, since tragedy, at its brightest, always arrived as a kind of dangerous schooling that taught the body before it taught the mind. Behind the threshold stands Antigone, mother of theatre's conscience, shining star of civic shame, while she looks less like a museum relic and more like a living nuisance who refuses to let a city tidy its mess with fine language. Listen closely, and the room declares itself before the first argument arrives, since the microphone keeps faith with trivia that pride would edit out. A chair's brief protest when I shift, the papery rasp of a page turned with impatience, the faint electrical hiss of a lamp that has served beyond its contract. Suspicion, which tends to earn frowns in seminar rooms, belongs at the start of this episode, since clean dilemmas with named sides suit examinations, whereas Sophocles keeps tugging the sleeve toward a quieter battlefield, where weapons look harmless until they draw blood. Consider how a decree travels, since it seldom arrives as a trumpet blast. A proclamation moves through tongues and seals, while it also moves through procedure, through the clerk's stamp, through the guard's board authority, through the tidy fiction that the world becomes manageable once it fits a column. Burial in Sophocles never stays inside poetry, because burial belongs to administration as much as to prayer, and a state that claims you're dead also claims your story, since the body functions as evidence for whichever order wins the day. A surprising truth presses forward when the ear leans close to the stone. Tragedy begins in the little sounds of compliance. Repetition turns a rule into something that resembles holiness, and a shrug offered as obedience can drop like earth onto a living thing, because instructions often disguise a hunger for innocence. When Antigone enters that civic machine, she does so at the machine's weakest joint, since power depends upon routine, and routine depends upon everyone agreeing that paperwork equals reality. A heroine of conscience may sing in the popular ear, yet a colder hearing catches an interruption of process, the refusal to let the city finish its sentence with ink. Modern life, despite its slogans, worships systems with a devotion that would embarrass an oracle, and that devotion shows itself most clearly when death arrives. A form appears, and a certificate follows, and a box gets ticked by someone who never met the person whose name they enter, while a call arrives with rehearsed sympathy that sounds kind until it starts steering you. Even where tenderness survives, the state still asks for a category, since categories keep budgets sane, and categories keep blame assignable, then categories keep a city from staring into its own abyss for too long. Antigone steps into that logic with dust on her fingers, while she refuses to let a brother become a file-marked traitor, because she understands, in bone-deep fashion, that a public label can outlive any human face. Sophocles gives her language about gods and unwritten law, yet the drama turns upon a social fact that polite people pretend belongs to other centuries. Whoever controls disposal controls legitimacy, since disposal determines which deaths get honored publicly and which deaths get handled discreetly. Our cynical age likes to claim superiority on account of courts and cameras, yet the old hunger persists, since every society decides whose dead receive candles, and whose dead receive quiet removal at an hour when witnesses sleep, and since euphemism always gathers around whatever a community feels ashamed to name. Comfort arrives quickly if Antigone gets framed as purity carrying a lantern, and comfort deserves distrust, since certainty keeps strange company. Conviction, when narrated by its owner, tends to sound heroic, while the body tells a harsher tale through trembling hands, through sleepless nights, through that animal knowledge that punishment approaches. Antigone feels less like a saint carved in marble, and more like someone who has recognized a trap and chosen her corner of it, since the city offered submission with survival, while blood offered fidelity with ruin, and ruin got selected with open eyes. That selection presses an awkward question into the lap, because moral speech enjoys hypotheticals and Antigone despises hypotheticals by stepping into consequence. What does conscience weigh when it stands before a system that calls itself order? What does a family owe when the state claims the right to define kin as threat? What does a citizen become when a body gets used as a lesson and relief whispers, almost lovingly, that it happened elsewhere? Take this episode as a walk along the edge, where ethics stops sounding like lecture and starts sounding like a door closing. I speak from the side of the living, while Antigone speaks from the side of the dead, and between those sides sits a thin, persistent idea. A city reveals its true theology through the way it disposes of bodies. Consequence, which keeps its own calendar, does the rest. The iron peg had bitten into the lime-washed wall before any of us learned our letters, and it held its small burden with the patient cruelty that belongs to cheap metal. A tragic face-piece, mouth cut open as though breath itself had been sentenced, brows swollen into that fixed anguish that artisans shaped for distance, while the hall's weak bulbs gave it a waxen pallor that felt half devotional and half forensic. I kept it there on purpose, near the door where coats collect rain, for the thing behaves like an oath once you grant it a vantage. It observed the hands that fumbled for notebooks. It registered the throat that cleared before speech. It measured the back row where a conscience hides behind a sleeve. You could call it a prop, yet it carried the older gravity of the prosopon, that Greek stage face whose material life tended toward linen, wood, glue, paint, and the quick rot of use, while the absence of surviving originals leaves us with painted pottery, later descriptions, and the stubborn testimony of theatre's architecture. A draught came in under the door, as Irish weather enjoys doing when it wants a vote in a seminar, and the facepiece trembled on its peg with a faint clink of wire against iron. That small sound, which resembled a coin dropped into a bowl, reminded me of dust on a corpse, for Sophocles placed dust at the centre of his argument, as though the smallest grit could outweigh a decree. Antigone entered the play, carrying a sister's rawness and a daughter's pride, and she carried also the knowledge that burial carries civic meaning, given that a polis claimed jurisdiction over the dead, in the same way it claimed roads and taxes, while the household claimed the dead by tenderness, by shame, by the stubborn continuity of blood. When Creon made his proclamation over Polynices, he acted as a man who had tasted civil war and feared relapse into faction more than he feared the gods below, and he spoke with that tone administrators adopt when they want the world to seem as tidy as a ledger, while he treated a body as a symbol, a warning fixed to the gate of Thebes. The mask looked on without blinking, and I confess that I loved it for that coldness, for a human face blinks its way into compromise, whereas a carved visage holds its court without fatigue. You sat with your pen poised as though you expected a definition, and the hall's faint smell of wet wool pressed theology into the air, while I asked you to imagine Thebes as a place of hard light, where limestone gives back the sun with a glare that scours the eyes, and where the road to the gates carries a taste of chalk and mule sweat. In such a place, the dead man left unburied becomes an object that rots in public, and the rot becomes pedagogy. Sophocles gave us guards who spoke like tired labourers, men who wanted wages and shade, and he gave us a king who treated speech as masonry, each word placed to hold the wall of authority upright. Antigone replied with fragments that carried a girl's ferocity. I knew I would die, while she placed the claim beyond any human statute through that bitterly calm insistence on ordinances that live outside ink. Creon answered as though he had swallowed the city's seal ring, which meant that he heard her piety as sedition, and he heard kin-love as an infection of policy. When you read that exchange in the safety of a room, theory can feel clean, yet dust in the fingernails refuses cleanliness, and the act of sprinkling grit over a brother's skin becomes the hinge that turns philosophy into consequence. A cough rose from the third row, and the facepiece answered with silence carrying more accusation than any heckler. I held a piece of chalk which shed powder onto my thumb, and that powder let me speak more honestly to the dead, for Antigone's courage arrived through powder and not through slogans. She bent, she scooped, she poured, she risked the eye of a watchman who had been paid to see. The guard who caught her behaved as men do when a small task becomes a cosmic problem, and he spoke in that aggrieved voice of the underpaid, while he dragged her before Creon as though delivering stolen property. Sophocles wrote the scene with a cynic's intelligence, for he let the state appear first through minor functionaries, through those who enforce orders. They never authored, while they protect themselves by claiming obedience. Creon's anger grew from a very old terror, the terror that a public ruler would seem weak, given that he had just inherited a city shaken by brother against brother, and weakness in a polis tastes like blood. A king who fears mockery begins to love rigidity, and rigidity begins to demand tribute, and a decree that began as a political signal becomes a metaphysical quarrel. The mask hung there, and the nail held fast, and the hall's air thickened as though winter had decided to sit among us. When Antigone stood before Creon, she carried a young woman's plain clothing, a peplos pinned at the shoulders, cloth folded into a practical drape that left the arms free for work, While Sophocles allowed her speech to do the ornament that garments refused, her words arrived as bare stone, each syllable struck for endurance. Creon answered with the imagined costume of office, with the posture of command, with the assumption that civic health depends upon a single voice, and he spoke as though plurality were treason. Antigone spoke as a daughter of Oedipus, while she carried the stink of that household's curse like smoking cloth, yet she also spoke as any sister might, given that burial belongs to intimacy, to hands that remember a body living. Sophocles, who understood Athens and the theatre's civic ritual, pressed this conflict into the audience's ribcage by making both claims plausible, while he refused the comfort of a tidy verdict. He made your mind wobble, and he made your stomach tighten, and he made the gods feel close enough to hear. Even Ismene's hesitation, which could look like cowardice in a moral pamphlet, gained dignity as soon as the scene gave her a throat and trembling breath, for she loved her sister while she feared the city, and fear can also love. A short laugh, half defensive, escaped someone near the window, and the mask remained grave, as though laughter itself required permission. I wanted you to feel the state's stubbornness as a physical substance, as something that weighs on the tongue, so I asked you to picture the edict as a plaque, bronze hammered thin, hung where citizens pass, letters cut deep enough to catch shadow, while wind carries dust that lodges in the grooves. Such objects belonged to Greek civic life, and their authority depended upon display, upon the outward certainty of inscription. The cruelty, therefore, belonged to a recognizable political logic. The city punished the dead in order to discipline the living. When Creon forbade burial, he performed an extreme version of a civic habit that Greek communities practiced in various ways when they wanted a traitor's corpse to remain a lesson. A body left for dogs became a public text, and every passer-by became a reader, even the illiterate. Antigone's response, which could seem at first like private piety, became public defiance, for she acted under the gaze of guards, under the threat of stone, under the weight of royal pride. Her conscience behaved like a knife pressed into her own palm, because it cut the hand that gripped it, and it cut also the hand that tried to seize it away. The facepiece trembled again, and the small sound resembled a verdict being stamped. A lecture hall invites abstraction, yet Sophocles wrote for a theatre where bodies sat under open sky, with the smell of sweat and sun on stone benches, while a festival gathered citizens into a shared rite that blended religion with politics. You therefore commit a quiet violence when you treat the play as a neat diagram. Antigone's speech carried heat, Creon's reply carried iron, and their collision gave off sparks that burned bystanders, and Sophocles kept those bystanders present. Ismene, who trembled between loyalty and caution, Hammon, who stepped into his father's presence with the tender danger of a son who loved yet refused submission, Tiresias, who arrived with blindness that saw further than any king. When Tiresias spoke, he brought with him the smell of burnt offerings gone wrong, for the seer reported that fire refused to take, while birds tore each other in the air, while the altars received polluted flesh. The gods entered through failed ritual, through the stubborn refusal of sacrificial smoke to behave, and the state's obstinacy turned into a cosmic problem that courts and councils could never settle. Your eyes went toward the hanging face, perhaps because you expected counsel, while it offered only carved anguish. I kept returning to the peg because it resembled Creon's own fixation, for he too hung his identity on a single hook, authority. A ruler can endure much when he carries plurality inside himself, yet Creon carried a solitary rigid self, and that self demanded worship. He spoke as though the city were his body, and any dissent became an infection, and Antigone's act became a fever to be cut out. Sophocles, with the cold humour of a dramatist who had watched councils behave like frightened animals, allowed Creon to accuse Antigone of arrogance, while the accusation rebounded like a stone thrown at a wall, because royal pride sat behind each sentence Creon uttered. Antigone's own pride burned, and Sophocles refused to polish her into a plaster saint, for she spoke with a fierce exclusivity I was born to share in love, while she clung to the irreplaceability of a brother with an argument that bruised modern ears. The play therefore carried the discomfort of a heroine whose purity held splinters, and splinters lodge in the reader's skin. The hall grew quiet, and motion came only from rain sliding down glass like slow script. When Hammon entered, he brought the smell of youth, of hair still clean, of a cloak worn for display, and he spoke with the careful diplomacy of a son who knew that a father's pride can explode like a clay jar dropped on stone. Hammon appealed to civic listening, to the idea that a king gains strength through heed, while he offered the image of a tree that bends in flood and survives, and Sophocles let that image sting, for Creon, who feared appearing pliable, answered with the harshness of a man who heard advice as humiliation. Their quarrel unfolded as a domestic tragedy inside the larger civic tragedy, and the scene became unbearable because love remained present, while violence also remained present, and the two presences twisted around each other like rope. When Creon threatened to execute Antigone before Haman's eyes, he committed a cruelty that exceeded politics, for he weaponized intimacy, and that act began the chain of deaths that returned to him like a boomerang carved from bone. The mask on the nail held its mouth open, and the room's air felt thinner. Antigone's punishment carried a special theatrical cruelty, for Creon chose a living tomb, and Sophocles knew what he was doing when he made the sentence spatial. He turned a moral quarrel into architecture. A stone chamber offered a paradoxical mercy, given that it avoided direct bloodshed while it permitted slow death, and it permitted also the state's hands to remain ceremonially clean. Antigone walked toward that chamber with bridal language on her tongue, while she called the vault her marriage bed, while she spoke to the dead as though they waited with wreaths, and the lyricism broke the audience's heart, because it revealed how death begins to masquerade as union when life offers only coercion. Under such pressure, law ceased to look like law and began to look like a curse, while kinship ceased to look like comfort and began to look like a trap, and conscience ceased to look like freedom and began to look like a sentence. A chair creaked, and the sound carried the embarrassment of anyone who shifts to avoid feeling too much. I watched your faces, and I watched also the hanging visor, and that fixed mouth gave me the courage to speak to God without piety's varnish, for the play forced a theological question that every polity tries to avoid. What happens when a civic ordinance clashes with a divine demand that carries older authority? Antigone invoked the gods below, the gods who guard burial and oaths, while she placed her confidence in a law that lacked inscription yet endured, and Creon treated that claim as revolt. Sophocles, who lived in a world where religious rites and civic identity braided together, staged the quarrel in order to show how authority, when it overreaches, wounds the sacred that gives authority its legitimacy. Tiresias therefore functioned as the drama's instrument of cosmic accounting, for he spoke of pollution that spread through the city's altars, and he presented the king with a stark arithmetic. A corpse left for dogs poisons the entire community. When the seer described birds with flesh in their beaks, he gave the audience a world where politics rises into the air as carrion, and the sky itself becomes a tribunal. The stage face seemed to lean forward, while it remained fixed, as though it had heard such arguments for 2.5 millennia. When Creon finally yielded, the yielding came late, and Sophocles made lateness the real villain, for the tragedy's engine runs on delayed understanding. Creon rushed to bury Polynices, and he hurried to free Antigone, while the verbs turned frantic, while the palace became a place of running feet, while the king's dignity collapsed into a man's panicked scramble. Sophocles shaped this reversal as a punishment that resembled mercy, for Creon gained insight at the hour when insight could only deepen pain. Antigone had already hanged herself, and Haman had already pressed steel into his own body after he failed to kill his father, and Eurydice, receiving the news, had already chosen her own death, cursing Creon with her last breath. A ruler's stubbornness therefore ripened into a harvest of corpses, and the state's pride became a private devastation, and the polis paid for its king's vanity, with blood that flowed inside the household, where politics likes to pretend it never enters. You breathed out, and the breath carried a tremor, and the mask hung above us like a cold moon. Notice how Sophocles punished the state through the family, for that structure revealed the ethical cost with cruel clarity. The king who claimed to protect civic order destroyed his own line, and the edict designed to stabilize the city left the palace emptied. Under such pressure, the opposition between public law and private affection began to look too tidy, for Sophocles showed how the public penetrates the private, and how the private returns to haunt the public, and how each realm borrows legitimacy from the other, while it pretends independence. Antigone's act began as kin duty, yet it became a civic scandal. Creon's order began as policy, yet it became domestic slaughter. The hanging face became my witness for this entanglement, for it too belonged to both spheres. It served ritual, it served art, it served public gathering, while it hid a human face that sweats and trembles behind it. Under the mask, breath condenses, saliva collects, the strap irritates skin, and the actor's eye searches for a mark on stone. Even performance teaches that civic spectacle depends upon bodily discomfort. A voice rose from the back, tentative, and it asked whether Sophocles offered a lesson or only despair. Instruction arrives through despair, said I, while my hand left a chalk smudge on the desk, provided you accept that teaching can cost blood. The mask watched that exchange, and its carved mouth held the shape of a scream that never finished. Consider the ethical event that occurs when you read this play inside a modern state, where bureaucracy replaces kings, where decrees arrive through paperwork, where violence hides behind procedure, where the refusal of burial takes subtler forms, an unmarked grave, a delayed funeral, a body kept as evidence, a family held in waiting until grief turns rancid. Sophocles asked you to see that stubborn authority loves abstraction, because abstraction frees it from the cry of the singular person. Creon's fixation on the traitor's example therefore required the erasure of Polynices' humanity, and it required also the erasure of Antigone's embodied grief. Antigone resisted through a bodily rite, through dust in the palm, through the bending of the spine, through the willingness to risk punishment, for a gesture that can appear tiny to a ruler yet enormous to the gods. The conflict therefore lived in the body before it lived in argument, and every attempt to turn it into tidy doctrine fails, for the play's moral weight rests in sensation, in the smell of decay at the gates, in the grit beneath fingernails, in the taste of fear in a guard's mouth, in the coldness of stone, where a young woman walked toward a chamber that served as her bridal room. The lights flickered, and the mask's shadow slid across the wall as though time itself had blinked. When I speak about conscience, I speak about an inner tribunal that carries its own torches, and Sophocles showed how that tribunal can become tyrannical, for Antigone's integrity carried a hardness that excluded, and her certainty bruised those who loved her. Yet Creon's authority carried a deeper peril, because it carried the coercive force of the city, and it could transform personal fear into public harm. The play therefore refused easy heroes, while it offered instead a landscape of competing fidelities, each demanding sacrifice. Greek tragedy often placed family curses inside civic crises, and Sophocles inherited that practice from a tradition whose other surviving plays reveal parallel anxieties, given that Aeschylus had already staged fratricide and the city's fearful accounting in Seven Against Thebes. Under that tradition, a king's voice can turn into a weapon, while a sister's vow can turn into a blade, and the chorus stands between them like a crowd at a roadside accident, compelled to watch. Rain kept speaking to the roof, and your pens kept whispering. A detail that tends to escape the tidy moral lecture involves the guard, because he carried an ordinary man's terror of punishment, and his terror trained him to flatter power. The watchman arrived with that comic cowardice tragedy loves to borrow from the marketplace, while he stammered about his innocence, while he begged to avoid blame, while he admitted that profit and self-preservation pull a man's tongue more strongly than justice does. Sophocles allowed the audience to laugh, and the laughter made the later deaths feel sharper, because laughter loosens the chest just before the blow lands. That is part of why the object on the nail matters for a lecture. A mask can contain comedy and grief in the same carved mouth, and the transformation from one register to the other occurs through the same wood and paint, as though Sophocles insisted that the city's ethical life must include both, because a community that loses its capacity for self-mocking humor tends to become Creon-like, rigid, punitive, hungry for obedience. The hanging face caught a sliver of light, and its eye-holes looked like wounds. Tiresias, arriving with his guide, brought a different kind of theatre into the theatre, because a blind seer requires the audience to feel how insight can exist without vision. Greek culture associated mantic authority with the gods, and the seer's words therefore carried a civic weight that exceeded any magistrate's seal, which meant that Creon's refusal placed him against more than a girl. He placed himself against a sacred infrastructure. When Creon accused Tiresias of corruption, he behaved like a modern politician who assumes that every warning must hide a bribe, because cynicism becomes a defense when one's own pride begins to crack. Tiresias answered with the bluntness of a man who has seen too much, and he described a world where sacrifice fails, where hearth-fire refuses its ritual function, where birds scream in unnatural frenzy. Under such imagery, the city becomes a body sick at the altar, and the ruler becomes the infection. The stage face did what a witness does, it endured. A classroom can tempt you into treating Creon as a monster, and Antigone as a spotless martyr, yet Sophocles placed flaws into both, which meant that the ethical event demanded participation rather than applause. Creon's initial motive carries a civic plausibility, because civil war destroys trust, and rulers in the aftermath of internal conflict often fixate on unity as the highest good. That fixation can begin as prudence, while it ends as brutality when it refuses limits. Antigone's motive carries a religious plausibility, because burial rites belong to the gods below as well as to family honor. That plausibility can begin as piety, while it ends as isolation when it refuses to see the claims of the living. Martha Nussbaum described this tragic condition through the language of vulnerability, where goodness remains fragile, because the world's competing claims force loss into every choice. Under that lens, Antigone's nobility gains a shadow, while Creon's civic concern gains a stain, and the audience becomes morally complicit, because every judgment carries its own violence. Your posture changed, and the change carried discomfort that looked like thought. Thucydides, writing about Athens during the plague, described a collapse of burial customs, and his sentence, fragmented, exhausted, carried the stink of bodies and the desperation of survivors. Under plague, he told how rights broke, how people acted in despair, how order fell away, and the passage carries a quiet kinship with Sophocles' nightmare, because it shows how a community's treatment of its dead reveals its moral health. When a state prevents burial, it acts as a self-made plague, and Creon's Thebes becomes diseased by decree. Antigone's dust, placed over flesh, becomes an attempted antidote, and the antidote carries a cost that the healer must pay in her own blood. Under such conditions, conscience stops resembling a private comfort, and it begins to resemble a tool that can be used to dig, to bury, to strike, to bleed. The mask remained suspended, and its still gaze felt like a trial without appeal. When the messenger brought news of Haman's death, Sophocles forced the audience to hear consequences in the messenger's breath, because the messenger carried the scene into language with the urgency of a witness who tries to outrun horror. Eurydice, hearing, withdrew into the house like a candle carried into a crypt, and her later death functioned as the tragedy's final tightening of the knot, because it proved that Creon's violence, though directed outward at a traitor and at a disobedient niece, returned inward into the bedchamber. Under Greek norms, women's laments could carry immense social power, even when men pretended to govern everything. Nicole Laureau wrote about lament as a voice that unsettles civic order, because mourning brings the household's pain into public hearing. Eurydice's curse therefore operates as the household's revenge upon the state. A queen's dying words strip the king of legitimacy more ruthlessly than any vote. The hall's radiator clicked, and the sound resembled bones settling. A question remains, and it must be asked with hands dirty, because Sophocles refused to let clean hands speak with authority. What does a life of destructive action do when it seeks escape from the complexity it created? Creon wanted simplicity, which means that he wanted a world where rule and obedience align, where policy produces order, where the city's enemies remain outside the wall, where kinship remains subordinate to decree. He attempted to compress the world into a single line, and tragedy punished him by expanding the world into a labyrinth. Under that labyrinth, every attempt at control produced a fresh strand of consequence, and consequence pulled him deeper. Antigone, choosing death through her own hand, sought an exit that looked like purity, yet Sophocles refused to present her suicide as pure triumph, because the play's universe treats self-killing as both agency and ruin, as both refusal and surrender. Creon, surviving, carried the longer punishment, survival with knowledge. The mask hung above us, and the nail held it as firmly as a verdict holds a guilty man. A final image must remain shapeless in the way. Water remains shapeless even when you pour it into a measured jug, so I returned to the peg when the room emptied, when coats lifted from hooks, when your footsteps faded down the corridor, when the building settled into night. The wind pressed against the door with soft insistence, and the facepiece swung a fraction, and the wire loop tightened on the iron, and the painted surface caught the last strip of fluorescent light. In that small motion I saw Creon alone in Thebes, carrying his dead as invisible burdens, walking through a palace where the air had turned sour, where every doorway recalled a quarrel, where every stone remembered a cry. He sought release from the tangle he made, and he found only the corridor of his own acts, which led him back to the same door again and again, until his feet learned the pattern, and his soul learned the trap. Under that imagined weight, my hand rose and touched the mask's rim, and the coldness travelled into the finger like a warning, and the nail's blunt head felt like the simplest instrument of sentence. And as the face swung slightly, catching the draught, it offered Creon's last fate in miniature, a life held up by a single point, turning gently in moving air, forever facing outward, forever unable to step down.